emerge into another process with mythology. Mythology is the process of language. The flow of language parallels the flow of nature. Both language and nature are characterized by a process flow, and in between them, like an arbiter of objectivity, is the rocky ridge of ritual. With that triple alliteration, you should be able to remember that. So the rocky ridge of ritual gives us a firm quality, a stability, an objectivity, which we could characterize, in fact we do characterize, in a formal way as existence. So that existence occurs on the ridge between two rivers of process. The river of nature as a process has a peculiar quality to it, and the proper way to deal with it, proper in an English sense, the proper way to deal with the mysteriousness of the flow of nature is to ascribe to it the characteristic, the defining characteristic of mystery. That the movement of nature is neither a comedy nor a tragedy, but a mystery. So that later on, when we talk about mystery religions, we mean to say that mystery religions recognize the characteristic of nature being the mysterious. And in terms of a numerical designation, nature would be given the designation of 0. So that our early movement in the education, using a ancient Chinese, an archaic Chinese way of characterizing nature, nature is Tao. Nature is Tao, and it has a 0 designation. Nature is a 0-based mystery. And connected to 0 is the oneness of existence, so that ritual has a designation of a 1. And so with a very simple initial binary encoding, reality occurs. The 0 of nature and the oneness of existence, 0 and 1, as a binary language, are able to make all of the forms that we see and all of the forms that we do not see. Both the visible and invisible are structured by this simple yet profound binary. Now, with any kind of a binary, anyone who works with computers, or with logic, or with the I Ching, or with ancient wisdom, anyone who works with it at all, Mother Nature, understands that when you bring 0 and 1 into a working proximity, then you have a connection, you have a relatedness, which produces of its own structure, of its own nature, a dynamic. So that when we talk about power, in a conscious sense later on, we will see, for instance, that the classical Greeks understood power to have a double component. Power for the classical Greeks had a component which they named dynamis, but it also had a second component which they named energeia. So that energy and dynamic are constituents together of power. When Thucydides writes his history, and next year we look at history and use Thucydides' great history of the Peloponnesian War, he says that the problems of the great war of the Greeks were problems of the state of dynamis, of power in terms of where it's going to go. That power in its purpose, in its vectoring, in its sequential ongoingness. The handling of the reins of power in the sense of controlling where it's going to go is a problem of dynamis, of dynamics. So that 2,400 years later, someone like one of the founders of sociology, modern sociology, Petrum Sorokin, could write a huge book on social and cultural dynamics. Or someone like Freud could talk about the dynamics of the libido, that the psychic power has a dynamics to it. Or that in textbooks on physics, you find a whole section on dynamics. And a whole other section on hydrodynamics. So that power has this dynamic quality to it in terms of where it's going to go. But it also has this kind of amperage, the energeia, the voltage, the oomph of it. When the yogi in classical India does his meditation and his ascetic quality, he builds what was called in Sanskrit tapas. Tapas is pure energeia. It has no dynamic whatsoever. It doesn't go anywhere, it is. And so energeia is a quality of existence, whereas dynamis is a quality of nature. Dynamis is the element of power that flows as a process, and if you could direct that process, it would go where you would like to go with carrying the oomph of existence with it. And so process and stability, objectivity, go together. And when they go together, when you have that kind of connectiveness, then one has a living form. So that nature and ritual together are not just a binary in a kind of a primitive sense, but they are binary in a primordial sense, that they occur and reoccur all the time forever after. So when we are talking about myth now, as we begin today, we have to recall always, we have to remember always that though we're not saying it all the time, we're assuming that everything we say about myth has a proviso about the connectiveness of the 0 and 1 of nature and ritual. They're always together. But because myth is a process, because myth itself has a dynamis, language has a dynamic. Language moves to go somewhere. It has a vector which, if we give it a purpose, it goes rather directly. But because of this, myth has a distinctly different relationality from nature to ritual. Myth parallels nature, but it connects to ritual. Language parallels nature, but connects to existence. And so one has to get used to, like a two-handed, hands-on acquisition of understanding. And that's what this education is all about. It's a large cycle of being practical and realistic about how to know what there is to know. And that the knowing requires all the time on the most strategic, fundamental, basic level, keeping track of two different hands. One, a hand of process, the other, a hand of objectivity. Yes, we do have to grasp and get it what is it, that's it. But at the very same time, we have to modulate into that grasping the flow of its phase-form cycle. And without pulling both those together, one does not have the focusing accuracy of the real. If you just go for objectivity, one is reminded of Gradgrind in Charles Dickens' great novel of Great Expectations. Facts, facts, facts. That's all I want. It's just facts. Well, if you have just facts, you're going to lose out on half the universe. You're going to miss out on the dynamic aspect of the universe, because the dynamism of reality is not in facts, not in objectivity. Only the energeia is there. And so people who are closed off become hypnotized by energy and identify power with energy, and are completely ignorant and thus completely open and vulnerable to the slightest movement of the mystery of nature, to the slightest power of language, to the slightest whiff of vision, to the enormous tidal wave of history, which are all processes, which are all dynamic, and all run in great parallels. So that in the vast ocean of the real, the divine light shining on that ocean of the real, there are strumming striations of process that work in deep parallels, nature and language and vision and history. And so one later in civilization here's God summed up as the Lord of history, the master of the dynamic of history, because history is a process, in no way is objective. And if you try to objectify history and deal with it in terms of power, you're building sandcastles on a beach at low tide. There's no chance, the probability is nil, that anything that you do will survive the next tide. So one has to learn to navigate history, which this generation has not done, which this century has not done, which the last 200 years has not done, has not learned to navigate history. And the boat is leaking. Not from lack of energy, not from lack of specific objectivity, plenty of that, but from a paltry, feeble non-understanding and non-acknowledgement of the deep, mysterious processes of nature, the shining processes of language, and the shimmering, phantasmal processes of vision, and the awesome tidal wave of history. All of these dynamic processes are going to broadside, as they have broadsided every generation of the last 200 years. And as we have seen, the broadside of war in the 20th century has produced catastrophic maiming of the psyche of men and women. Men and women today do not dare mature beyond the age of 12 because there lies the awesome necessity of bringing process and objectivity together in terms of fertility. And this is a terrible world to be fertile in. And so an education like this is an indispensable reconnoitering, not only of the situation, which is indelibly there all the time, we're born into it, but also in that reconnoitering is the process by which men and women have matured themselves to the point of being able to deal with the situation and get out of the peril and into the good times. Now, because Ritual objectifies existence. It registers in bodies. Why in the real, why in this universe should there be physical bodies? Because that's where existence registers. The atom, the molecule, the species, the cell, the body. And so our body is like a good token of the way in which existence registers. And it registers its objectivity because something is done. Ritual is an action. Ritual is a happening. Ritual is pragmatic, pragmatos, it happens. And as something is done, the oneness takes the dynamis of the movement of process and makes a journeyer. And that's what the atom is. The atom is in a journey. It is flowing within the dynamic of nature, but it has the existence of an energy of something happening. And so all early understandings of the natural world is that whatever is here emerges out of the mystery of nature and emerges to be a shimmering stability. It's an energized body in a flow process of the mystery. This is the correct way to talk. It's not a metaphysical language at all. It's just simply a traditional, wise way to talk about how things are. But we now, with mythology, beginning today, 3 months, 12 weeks in mythology, we're going to complicate the scenario. We no longer just have the simple binary of 0 and 1, but we have a tertiary element coming in. We have the 2 of myth. If nature is a 0 base, if ritual is a 1 base, myth is a 2 base. And by 2, it's not just the simplistic designation of a 2, but there's always, as you have learned so far, the deep connotation of the pair, the double. In a way, language in its way of bringing into process not the mystery of nature, not the oneness of existence, but it brings the pairedness of experience. So one of the most archaic and yet arcane ways of talking about myth, about language, is that language brings the pairedness of experience into play, into process. And so the whole process of myth is about this pairedness of experience which parallels the mystery of nature and connects to the objectivity of existence. And so all mythology has this double quality. It parallels nature but connects to existence. And one needs to keep a distinctness here and not let them just smudge together and blur together, because we're trying to educate ourselves. And we're right on the threshold with mythology, with language, of being able to understand a great square of the way in which the real is. Because the great square is that just as the process of nature has its complement in the objectivity of ritual, the body registers the movement of nature. Some other objectivity registers the movement of myth. The process of language registers in an objectivity, and that objectivity is the mind. And the symbol, the mind, is as objectively real as the body. So that mind and body are like a parallel. Just as myth and nature are parallels, ritual and symbol are parallels. And just as ritual connects to nature and also connects to myth, myth connects to ritual and parallels nature, but myth also connects to symbol. So that language becomes a arbitrating process in between body and mind, in between ritual and symbol. So that if one were going to focus, going to telescope in, or microscope in this case, bring the microscope of superior visioning in, one could see this river of language flowing between two rocky ridges, one of ritual and one of symbol. And that it's a very great naivete to think that the mind is some kind of secondary thing, and that the body is the only basic thing. That people who deal with the mind are dealing with aesthete things. The mind is as objectively real as the body. The health of the structure of the objectivity of the mind is as important as the health of the structure of the objectivity of the body. And the mind has its cardiovascular system. It has its bones. It has its being in objectivity. But we'll get to that. In 3 months, we'll get to look at symbol. And now we're just beginning with myth. And you begin to see that myth, as a dynamic process, has a quality. Its quality is that it carries with it, because of connection, it carries with it as a substrate to its own flow, the sequence of ritual. Ritual is a substrate to the tape of experience. The objective registering of sequence, that is of order, and of cycle, that is of rhythm, and of detail, which is portion and proportion. The sense of order and rhythm and proportion of language has a ritual substrate that predispose it to certain forms, that precondition the choices that one has in language. And so, in order to speak in a very masterful way, one has to master the substrate of ritual that goes along with it. Just as there was a very old ancient wisdom before language was really mature enough to be able to be masterful, and the substrate of ritual comprehensible in a complete way, long before language achieved that kind of predominance, and that kind of predominance is characteristic of our kind of primate species, not just Homo sapiens, Homo Neanderthal also. But before that, there was a species of men and women, Homo erectus, for whom language was not the masterful index of the real, but for whom action was the masterful index of the real. Ritual. And the whole wisdom of that phase of our ancestral origin was to be wise in action, in a silent action. Perspicacious in the doing of things, of life. And the substrate of that level of ritual is nature. So just as ritual is the substrate of myth, nature is the substrate of ritual. So that when ritual becomes a substrate to myth, it carries along with it its substrate of nature. And so one has a rather interesting kind of parfait. It's not just an annealing of myth and ritual together, not just putting a ritual floor under the structure of language, but there's a natural foundation to the ritual floor that comes along with it. And because of a universal quality that parallels vibrate together, it's like two strings of an instrument that are tuned. The dynamic quality of language forms vibrates in parallel to the dynamic forms of nature, so that the substrate of the substrate forms a parallel to language, and the substrate itself, ritual, forms a connection to language, so that language has a double quality. It has a ritual connectedness, but it has a natural, mysterious parallel. And so language, all of itself, not only can say how things cause and connect, but it can also, in a vibratory way, make mystery happen. And so language has this double capacity. It can say bluntly what's what in terms of action, pick that book up. But it can also say something rather evanescently. Handle that book with awe. It contains your life. And so language has this tremendous capacity. And we'll see that when you put together in the parfait all four levels, nature, ritual, myth, and symbol, that parfait becomes a pair of pairs which meet to become a square. And that square is this is an easy mnemonic, that square is the integral of the real. A square is the form of integration. Its form, though, is not a square as a unity so much as a pair of pairs. The square is not so much a 4 as it is 2 2s. And it's 2 2s in an additive way, but it's also 2 times 2 in a multiple way. The multiple is a dynamic quality. The adding is an energy way. And that this energy and dynamic duo, you remember the original dynamic duo, Batman and Robin? This dynamic duo of energy and dynamic, when it goes into a transformation, they turn inside out. And in consciousness, what has the multiple qualities then is not the dynamic, but the energy. There are energetic orders to consciousness, but they are in a complement to the dynamic orders of integration. So that the whole cycle of nature is a complement to the cycle of consciousness, because there's a whole other square. The second year of our education is not the square of the integral, but it's the square of the differential. And so this education is rather vast, rather comprehensive. It's 2 hands, and it's very practical. Without both, you're looking with one eye to try to drive. And it's okay if you're on a burro, but if you get into a race car, you better have both eyes. You have to have that depth perception. And the future, what did they say in Back to the Future? Your children are going to go where there are no roads. They're going to need both eyes and both hands. And so this education is for that. We could say then, in a kind of a metaphor, that the geology of the real has strata, and that the strata always alternate in pairs, and the pairedness and alternation is always process and objectivity. And like a little mnemonic, you can just tell with an open hand and a closed hand. That simple little graphic presentation, that's how it works. And when we come to our material, we see that we try to keep a paired quality to the very method of our movement. Our dynamic in this education is to take a pair of texts, not a single book, but a pair of books together, and to use that as a guideline, not as a be-all and end-all. It's not a methodological doctrine which encases us. It's just simply a mountain climbing rope that we're going to use in our ascent. We're going to pair books because we know we can get up the face of the unknown by using this tool. And along with it, the pitons that are places where we can fasten that rope, that paired text process, that methodological tool of ascent. The pitons are coming every Saturday morning. The simple coming here is a complementary use of process to the objectivity of the pairs of text. The pairs of text, the pairs of books in themselves, even if you stack them all in the right sequence, would just simply be objects standing on a shelf or on a table. They don't do anything. Dem bones can't get up and walk around. But if you add to it the dynamics of this process, the Saturday morning playtime, if you add that to it, those bones can get up. It's just like Inanna, who is a corpse in hell, until the water of life is sprinkled on her corpse and she comes back to life. She stands up and is able to walk out of hell. Just so, even if we were in a condition of total death, a corpse hung on a hook in hell, when the waters of life are brought back to us, we can live again and walk out free. This is an ancient mythological way of speaking. And this ancient mythological way of speaking is something we have to sensitize ourselves to. Now we're going to use a pair of books. We're going to use two different kinds of mythology. We're going to use Greek mythology because it's very familiar and because it structures a lot of the development of civilization that we happen to need to use. Not only the civilization that's useful to us to get to the stars and other planets, but the civilization which also cages us. So we have to learn Greek mythology, but we also need to have a pair to it which is somewhat different. And the pair that we're going to use to begin with is Sumerian mythology. And to present Greek mythology and Sumerian mythology, we're going to use two women. The woman for presenting Greek mythology is Jane Ellen Harrison, the most detested because the most brilliantly intellectual woman in Victorian England. She was the Mary Wollstonecraft of her generation around the turn of the 20th century. In Cambridge, in England, around 1900, Jane Ellen Harrison was the boogeyman to the men because she was smarter than anyone. She was tremendously insightful. And her book, the prolegomena to the study of Greek religion, is still in print a century later, still being read. Because she is the first classicist to bring together the discoveries of anthropology and archaeology into classic studies. Classic Greek and Latin studies had for hundreds of years been a male privilege of the realpolitik of the Western world. Since the Renaissance, men studied Greek and Latin classics as models to know how to run the world and to outcompete each other. And it had been raised to a fine art in the British Empire of the 19th century. The only competitors to them were the Germans. And the German and the English language minds vied with each other of who was the dominant future controller of the world by virtue of having mastered the tools of the classical origins of civilization. And into this mix came Jane Ellen Harrison, who said, all of you are rather out of date because the lessons of science from anthropology and archaeology and psychology are germane to the way in which one understands the Greeks and Romans in all of the spectrum of their doing. She's the first one to bring in Freud and Jung and Fraser and Sir Arthur Evans and Flinders Petrie and the whole range of anthropology, archaeology, and psychology, and filled out classic studies by saying if you haven't read another 10,000 volumes on this outside of classical studies, there's no way you can understand who Zeus is, who Homer is, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Plato, the whole gamut. She was a threat. Now, a century later comes the great translator of the Inanna cycle, Diane Volkstein. And Diane Volkstein's translation of the Inanna cycle from ancient Sumer is our second book. And I'm pairing it with Jane Ellen Harrison. Diane Volkstein, just a very wonderful kind of translator, one of hundreds in the world today, a woman whose talents are duplicated in other fields by thousands of women. So she's a democratic example of the way at the end of the 20th century, there are maybe tens of thousands of women capable, whereas at the beginning of the 20th century, there were just the conspicuous lone examples like Jane Ellen Harrison. So there is a method here of pairing together, not just Greek mythology with Sumerian mythology, but encasing in our education further reverberations, the development of the intelligence of letting the dynamic of women join the energy of men in the making of a new civilization. Because without the dynamic process of women being joined to the energized stability of men, there's no fertility. Life doesn't happen. Civilization, a new civilization, won't happen. Now you ask a very good question. Why do we need a new civilization? Because the old civilization is dead. It's not going to work anymore. No forms that have worked for the last couple thousand years are ever going to work again. They're all museum pieces. Things like political parties are dead. Things like nations are dead. All of those forms continue to hold only by inertia, which is running down. The entropy is rather fast by the end because it's an asymptotic devolution. It's like turning off geometrically. But this turning off geometrically, this shutting down of previous qualities that dominated is the very essence of evolution. Because as an old dominant quality shuts down, it evokes from, not forces, but evokes from the unknown a new dominant quality that can rise up and come into play and progressively take over. This is the way evolution happens. And so the wise paleontologist talks about the liberation of a new controlling element. As long as primates were on all fours, they could go just so far. When they stood up and became bipedal, walking on two legs, and freed the hands became the driving mechanism by which a whole new phase of primates came into play. And when the hand is liberated from having to walk, the hand then becomes a very refined driving force by which the brain then takes on an evolution. In his Ascent of Man series, Jacob Bernowski said the hand is the cutting edge of the mind. And in a paleontological way, the hand is the cutting edge of the brain. The whole physiological development of the cortical structure is all based on the hand, and the recutting of the cortical structure is based on language. The hand of ritual begins the enlargement of it, the tongue of speech rearranges it. So that the cortical taxonomy of the brain becomes driven first by the hand and then by the speech. And so if you came to very wise Frenchmen like André Leroi-Gourhan, you would have a seminal book called Gesture and Speech. The movement of the hand, the sound of the voice. The energy of the hand, the dynamics of the speech. And that those two phases together in the right sequence bring into play a pattern of objectivity known as the mind. And when the mind is brought into objectivity, the whole integral square of the real comes into form, comes into firmness, and evokes from the unknown a complete transformation of that square into another cycle, a cycle of consciousness. Let's take a break and we'll come back. Let's rearrange ourselves after the break, comb out the joy of chaotic life, and come back to laser-like tuned. I make this coherent so that you could take the audio or video and play it many times. And sometimes the material requires humor and sometimes just a directness. And so this morning it required a directness. But I'll try and relax back from that just a little bit and add some charm. Not too much charm, because charm songs put us to sleep, but just a little bit. When we're working this education, when it's happening, we're not only taking pairs of books, but we're aligning pairs of books. And we're aligning them in a sequential form, which is as simple as ABC, because it has only 3 stages. A, B, C. So we're taking a pair of books, then we're taking a second pair of books, then a third pair of books. So we're aligning 3 pairs of books. Now when you take 3 pairs like this, you have a primordiality of structure that's invoked. Invocation is the way to the divine. If If you want to get God on your side, you have to be good at invoking. And the way in which a divine dynamic comes into play in a human stability is to have your invocation carefully crafted so that it's beautiful. Now, integration always happens to the nth degree with a square. But if you arrange all four phases of an integral, then all that you have is your control. And so the ancient technique was to arrange three of the four phases and let the fourth phase find itself. And so the ancient wisdom pattern was always to give you, in the teaching, three corners of the square and let you find the fourth corner by intuition. So we just arranged three pairs of text, and what would be the fourth pair is simply an interval of intuition. And in keeping with the use of books for the pairedness, we just use a single book for 1 week as an interval. And it's the discovery corner of that square of the integral. When you have pairedness in the primordial way, you do not have pairedness as in two parallels primordially. The primordial pairedness is ritual and nature, so that you have a connection, you have a right angle. So the right angle is the most archaic of all. It's the anchor point of structure. So later on in classical Greece, when consciousness was becoming not only integrated but differentiated together in someone like a Pythagoras, the right angle was the intuitive foundation of the whole use of differential consciousness in an integral structure where number was the key, symbolic key to the sequence of bringing together. But the sounding of the sequences was in an open matrix of taking the numerical sequence and rearranging it so that it would play music. If you simply take the octave and numerically sound it out by its integral sequence, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, you have the scale, but in order to have music, you have to play with the scale. You have to have notes from all over the scale that go into a melodic form, and the melodic form plays on the substructure of the scale. If you stay frozen onto the scale, there's no music, there's no lyric. And so Pythagorean music is the classic example in our civilization of someone with differential consciousness who understands that while the right angle of the connectedness is the essential anchor point for the structure, you have to allow that structure to come into its fullness, into the geometry of the completed form, and then you play with the completed form. Not in a geometric way, but in a musical way. So deep was the understanding and appreciation of that Pythagorean realization 2,500 years ago that 50 years ago a man received the Nobel Prize for Literature for writing a novel about that very process. His name was Hermann Hesse, and his novel was Das Glasperlenspiel, The Glass Bead Game, won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1946. And Joseph Neck there was a master of the future because he understood not both mathematics and music. And then when you have both those together, then you have the hands which are able to envision a new form of civilization. And half a century ago, the Nobel Prize for Literature went to such a future vision of the possibilities of man. We need to understand our pairs of books operate as connections, but when three pairs are aligned together, the alignment produces three angles that come together and they make a triangle. But in the process of having the three angles come together, if they maintain their 90-degreeness, you would have no way to have a triangle, to have a form which would achieve objectivity. The most you could do would be to have two 90-degree angles which would form a straight line. So the angles have to change. They have to become 60-degree angles, and you can have three 60-degree angles and then have an equilateral triangle. And the equilateral triangle is the first plane geometrical form that comes into manifestation. So that 60-degree angle becomes an archaic place in mythology for the registering of ritual exactness to bring form into being. And so a 60-degree angle becomes extremely powerful. And later on, some 3,000 years later, someone like Frank Lloyd Wright, trying to envision a new architecture by using a transformation of ancient wisdom, realized that if you use a 30-degree angle, a pair of 30-degree angles, pairedness of 30-degree angles would make the 60-degree angles, which would give you the equilateral form of primordiality. But by using a 30-degree angle, one has then a dynamic, energized complementation, so that the structure of a building based on the 30-degree angle would be new and yet old at the same time. It would be ancient wisdom, but future wisdom also at the same time. And towards the end of his life, when Wright was designing buildings that live when people walk in them, instead of buildings that are appreciated statically by looking at them standing still, Wright's architecture moved into a new civilization that has not yet fully appeared. The pilot building that he used for the 30-degree angle was the Kalita Humphreys Theater in Dallas, Texas. But the large project that he put the thing into play was the Civic Center in Marin County in San Rafael. And if you go to the San Rafael, Marin County Civic Center, the building comes alive if you see it, if you experience it, at the rate of a walk, about 2 miles an hour. Because at the dynamic of 2 miles an hour, the whole energy of that structure comes into play in a way which makes geometry sing. The architectural music of Wright is of a whole other civilization in the future that's there already, but is only there if you walk through the building, humming all the while. And so the new is already here, it just isn't recognizable from the eyes of the old. The eyes of the old are used to a static there-ness, where the eyes of the new, whatever it will be a moving dynamic. The stability will be in the dynamic, not in the static. We will trust not rituals that are, but rituals that happen. The old understanding was that when Moses asked, "Who shall I say sent me?" the old translation was, "I am." that I am. Whereas the more exacting translation is, tell them I will be who I will be sent you. This is a new way of understanding. And here the Ten Commandments are not on tablets of clay, but as Jeremiah said, a language that's written on the heart and mind of man. And whenever the heart and mind move together, then that language is spoken. And one then understands what to do in terms of that language. That, incidentally, was an insight which was used in the last aeon. It's not even new. It's already 2,000 years old. The new is yet something yet again. But it's an example of how sophisticated 2,000 years ago people were already. Now, it used to be thought that Homer could not have written down his epics because he lived about 1000 BC, and there's no written Greek 1000 BC. The masculine Greek Latin experts of the 19th century argued about whether Homer could have been written down and that it must have been oral poetry because it could have been only delivered orally. Whereas the input of archaeology, the input of psychology, the input of anthropology, qualities that were championed by Jane Ellen Harrison, have shown progressively over the 20th century that not only was there a written Greek in 1000 BC, but a written Greek archaically in 2000 BC, and before that, a written epic language predating that by at least another 400 years. So that 1400 years before Homer wrote his epics at the very earliest, there was a female writer who wrote her epics, which founded literary civilization. And her name was Enheduanna. Enheduanna. And Enheduanna is the author of the Inanna epic of Samaria. And Enheduanna, we have a little portrait of her, of a seal. We can't focus in on it. In fact, even if you have the book, you can't focus in on it. It was destroyed a long time ago, many thousands of years ago, and it was found in the archaeological digs around Nippur. And there's a portrait of Enheduanna there at the very center. She was rather favored because her father was the founder of the empire of the First Fertile Crescent. Her father was Sargon of Akkad. And he came into rule about 2330 BC, which meant that he was born about 2370 BC, which means that his daughter was born probably somewhere around 2350 BC. And she was the great poet. She was the great priestess. She was the great prophetess of the Sumerian Akkadian civilization. And the mythology of Inanna was the first written mythology in the whole world. Now, this written mythology of Sumerian Akkadian, when it was written down about 2300 BC, came about 200 years after the great development of the first true pyramids in Egypt. So the Egyptian true periods of the 4th dynasty are followed very closely by the mythology of Inanna, written down by Enheduanna, about the time of the 5th dynasty of Egypt. Now, the first true pyramids of Egypt are temples that have the hieroglyphic language recorded on the inside. And one could say that this is the world's first written mythology. But it is a written hieroglyphic mythology that is supposed to be read by only one person and only after they died. Only the pharaoh was supposed to read that mythology, it was a writing for the pharaoh's eyes only, and only after death. So in a very technical way, the Egyptian pyramid texts predate by 200 years the first written mythology of Sumeria and Arcadia. But that's only in a very technical sense. The first public documents that were available to a reading population, a literate population of nobles, came here from this woman, Enheduanna. So we're using Diane Volkstein, who's a late 20th century translator, but she's translating a woman writer from 4,300 years ago, who founds the literate tradition of what became Western civilization. So Jane Ellen Harrison is writing about the foundations of classical Greek that once were taken as the literate foundations of the Western world. That Homer's epics once were thought to be the first foundation of civilization to be recorded and finally written down. And so we take the 19th century view of the origins of Western civilization and the late 20th century views of the origins of Western civilization and pair them together. I say all this so that you can see that the pairs of books have been selected out not by some simplistic process of tossing coins, but by a progressive sieving action, incidentally invented in Alexandria about 300 BC. It was called the Sieve of Eratosthenes. Eratosthenes was one of the first great librarians of the Musaeans library there in Alexandria. And he found that if you take the paired quality and run it into a horizon of 7, take 1, split it into 2, take 2, split it into 4, 4, split it into 8, split it into 16, split it into 32. By the time you run that through 7 phases, you will have a form. It's called the Sieve of Eratosthenes. You will have a bifurcation form that differentiates. Not a true differentiation as we would understand now in the 21st century, but a very good Neolithic approximation of what true differentiation is. What would true differentiation be now? Not the Sieve of Eratosthenes, but sort of the processes of differential calculus is a true differential consciousness. But 2,300 years ago, Eratosthenes' sieve will do. Eratosthenes was learned because he could read every book in the world. In Alexandria, all the books in the world were collected together in one place. It was called the Musaean, not the museum, which is a Roman translation of it. A museum is a place for keeping the dead things. A Musaean is the temple of the muses. It's a place for keeping the live things. What live things? The books which have the energy in the order which has the dynamic. And that the books, when used in the right way, produce the music of the real. Not only do you have the notes arranged in the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do octave, but you're able to take those notes out of the octave and put them into a melodic line. And so in Alexandria at the Musaean, all the books in the world were brought into the octave unit arrangement. How many books were there? There were more than 1 million. They were in scrolls at that time because there were no books yet. Everything was in scrolls. There were about 600,000 scrolls that had 2 or more things on them, and about 400,000 that had single scrolls. About 1 million scrolls. They one time all belonged to a woman named Cleopatra. They were her personal property. And when her boyfriend, Julius Caesar, was trying to rough up the Alexandrians during the Alexandrian War, and he burnt a lot of the ships in the great harbor because some of the buildings of the museum came down to the harbor. What buildings came down? The royal palace, the Bruchion. So when he burnt the ships in the harbor, they caught the palace on fire, and the fire went up into part of the museum and burnt about 20% of the library, 20% of the books in the world. And he felt so bad about it that he took the entire library from Pergamon and gave it to Cleopatra to fill in. So it was larger than ever. It was about 1.6 million volumes at that point. So when Augustus Caesar, who was the next owner of that library, took over, he took over the largest library in the world as his personal possession. No wonder he felt that he knew everything. Or, as Mort Saul once said in one of his more humorous kind of evenings, he said, "I may not know everything, but I have people on my staff who do." There is a way in which the actuality of how things happen is finally graspable, but you need to put together the things and the process that brings them alive. If you don't have the mysterious process of life added to the sequence of things, there's no music. The sequence lies dead on the table. The bones are in the grave. Men and women are on the surface of the planet, but they don't do anything. They don't dance. And the gods love dancing. They like music. They like us to do something that's of interest. And to just sit around popping pills doesn't entertain them. They don't like it. So the next range of flatworms get a chance to evolve, and we become fuel for their industries. We use the dinosaurs as oil, and our bones will be oil for another civilization in geologic time if we don't start to dance and sing. There's a whole ecology of good sense of why to get educated. We talked a little bit before the break about how parallels happen. Processes parallel each other, and objective ridges, rocky ridges of ritual, rocky ridges of symbol. A third rocky ridge that parallels ritual and symbol will be art. Art is objective. Art is as objective as the body of existence, as the structures of the mind. And we'll see that there's a fourth objectivity, and that's the cosmos. Science. Science is the study of the cosmos in its objectivity. But the objectivity of the cosmos does not manifest until the ocean of the process of history is put into play completely. There's no cosmos without a fertile history. So cosmos and history are related together. They're an anchor point. They're a connection. And without the process of history being full, there's no trigger to pull so that the cosmos happens. The cosmos is only alive for a people who have mastered the process of history. Then it is alive. Then it dances and sings. Then all the morning stars sing together, and all the constellations move in reverberations of octaves, of scales that one hasn't even imagined yet. And it becomes really a very big party. And the divine loves that, likes that, wants that to happen. Myth parallels nature so that language then can be said, because language is myth. If myth parallels nature, then language parallels mystery. which means that mythology in its dynamis is mysterious. Language is mysterious. There is a grammar to language which is ritualistic, but there is a mystery to language which is natural. And so when you have a really master of language, like a Dante says one's images need to be natural in order to have cosmic poetry. And if your images are not natural, they don't have the sizzle of mystery in them. So no matter where you want to go with language, in order to have it fertile, you have to have images that are parallel to the mystery of nature. So that images in language do not refer in a connective way to nature, they refer in a reverberational parallel way to nature. So images need to resonate with the mystery of nature, not connect to them. So if you have images that are definitely connecting to nature, there's a scrambling on a massive scale of intelligibility. One is missing out in many ways what's real. Because when images connect to what seems to be nature, it means that instead of using nature, you're using a surrogate, because nature only connects to existence, to ritual. And myth connects to ritual. So what's happening is that one is mistaking ritual structure for nature. That's the only way to get images to have a referential connection. So if one's using a language and you think you're hot stuff, you think you're logical and poetic and everything because your images connect to nature, the reference, this means that, you can make the connection, that's a sign of insanity or unsanity. In a divine court, you've convicted yourself. They don't even have to make a case. They don't need a prosecutor. You hung yourself. Images that connect to things are immediately a gross error. And to think that you could make a dictionary of definitions of language because you can make the causal connections, the referential pointing to things, connecting the process of language with ritual and thinking that that then has anything to do with describing nature much less accurately, one is wrong. All you're doing is that you're inculcating ritual as the appearance, as the actuality. So the appearance becomes the actuality. And existence, which is an appearance of the mystery, is no way to tell myths of wisdom. And so all ancient men and women, even at the beginning, even in Sumer, Akkadian, 2,300 years ago, Enheduanna was specific to show, because the whole center of the myth of Inanna included a descent to the underworld. And that descent to the underworld is archetypal myth of divesting yourself of the things which would be an identifiable matrix, so that your language, the very language of telling the myth, tells about how you have to divest yourself of the things which made you what you are. So that Inanna, as she descends into the underworld to visit her sister, has to divest herself, has to lose all of the 7 defining things which made her queen of earth. So that she arrives at the center of the underworld completely nude with no definitions whatsoever. She arrives there as a zero base part of the process and has no defining existence, no existential stability whatsoever. And because she has no existential stability, she is only a mysterious process, pure and zeroly simple. She, in her body, is reduced to a corpse. But as soon as the water of life, as soon as the process of the mystery of nature is brought into play with that corpse, she comes back alive again. Had she have kept any of the defining characteristics with her, she would have been dead forever. Because rebirth only happens when you're able to divest yourself of all things and come back to zero-based purity of everlastingness. The Spirit is that quality which is there in the mystery of nature, and in no way is limited by the defining qualities of existence. The defining qualities of existence allow for an identification. And if you agree to that identification, when the identifying marks are erased, you're erased. But if you know enough to cut loose and let all the identifying marks go, you can be brought back to life indefinitely, permanently, eternally. Have you never heard you have to lose your life to have a life eternal? Never heard that. There is a quality in this educational process where you have to be spry. You have to be like an acrobat. You have to be willing to not only swing on the high bars, but to let loose and tumble in the air. And hopefully it's not a bungee jump, because there's no cord. Unless you have that climbing rope of the pairs of texts that we're using, but that's only useful if you keep coming every Saturday as a baton, to allow for that to work together. Otherwise, the entire tandem doesn't happen. It isn't that I don't deliver it, I'm not enough of an expert to deliver it, or that you're not enough of an expert to get it. I'm expert enough and you're expert enough. All we have to do is come together in an alignment way long enough for it to catch fire and come into language and come into symbolization, come into envisioning, and come into personal art of life. Then we just have to face the process of history together. You know, in the Greek mythology, it's like St. George and the Dragon is a descendant of the Greek mythology. You have to slay the dragon. And once you slay the dragon, then you get what there is to get. But in the older mythology, of which Beowulf is a part, the ancient Sumerian Akkadian mythology, the dragon is not the only problem. There's a worse problem, because the dragon always has a mother, and she is tougher. So like with Beowulf, when you slay Grendel, after a while, you have to face Grendel's mother. And that's a toughie. Because the only way to win that encounter is to give up your life. Only through transcendence and rebirth could you win against Grendel's mother. This goes back to the ancient Sumerian mythology. The Greek mythology, Zeus had a mate, Hera. So Zeus and Hera went together. But in the Sumerian mythology, the sky god, An, had two mates, had a pair of mates. He not only had the earth goddess as a mate, but he had the ocean goddess as a mate too. Sumerian's much more comprehensive than the Greek. They realized that the earth, which is like the land, is only part of the earth. The other part is the vast ocean. So the ocean goddess and the earth goddess both had to be joined to the sky god. So that in the archaic Sumerian Akkadian mythology, there's a feminine balance as you have to take both into consideration. You have to take an earth goddess and also, they don't call it ocean. Oceanos is a Greek term. But the Sumerian Akkadian phrase is the watery deep, the goddess of the watery deep. And you have to take her into consideration also. Now, in the marriage between the sky god and the goddess of the watery deep, out of that in Sumerian mythology comes Enki, the god of wisdom. But out of the marriage of the sky god with the earth goddess comes a brother to Enki, half-brother to Enki, named Enlil. And descended from Enlil will be Inanna. Enlil is the grandfather of Inanna. But Enki is the grandfather of Gilgamesh. So in the Sumerian mythology, there's a very ambidextrous symmetry that one has to keep track of all the time. And just mastering the mythology of Inanna is only one declension of one part of the story. One would have to master also the other complement, which is the masculine declension of Gilgamesh. So one would have to master Inanna and Gilgamesh together to get the focus. And when those two are brought together, one sees that the Sumerian Akkadian civilization was very mature, extraordinarily mature. And no wonder that they suddenly jumped the quality of relationality in terms of holding a civilization to. They jumped it about 20 times the volume that it was. Before this mythology could be written down and that civilization's bones hold, the best that people could do was association of city-states in a rather small area of the world. After that, they spread from the area of the Central Asian steppes all the way to Greece, everything from Samarkand to Thessaloniki, and all the way down to Egypt, and all the way up to the top of the Caspian. So that one had a rather wide swath of the world for the first time. You had a civilization that went from the Aegean ports to the Mediterranean ports, to the Persian Gulf ports, to the Indian Ocean, to the top of the Caspian and all of the Black Sea. So you had a civilization that was a fertile crescent, a very fortuitous kind of a name, a fertile crescent because it bridged for the first time different civilizations, so it brought a meta-civilization within reach of mankind for the first time. The civilization of Egypt, the civilization of Sumer, the civilization of India, and the civilization of ancient Iran, it brought all four of them together for the first time into contact with each other in a living way. But in 2300 BC, it was too much to go another step from that. It was enough just to get that step. And in fact, the great international age of the age of Enheduanna and her father Sargon lasted only for about another 150, 200 years. And devolved because it was too sophisticated for people to keep up. And it needed several attempts to try to put it together, but it took 2,000 years to finally put it together and make it work. And the figure who finally put it together and made it work was Alexander the Great. That was his vision, to reconstitute the Fertile Crescent of Sargon, of Akkad, but make it stick. That's another story. But you can see that this education touches on all of the major issues that make sense out of anything. But our process of proceeding is just simply 2 hours each Saturday and to pair up books into alignments of triads, punctuated by a fourth corner that's just there intuitively with one volume. And by going through that process in a double annual cycle, 2 years, we can put the Gestalt together in such a way that it's like having learned to type or having learned to ride a bicycle. Though you're not conscious of all the steps in between, it's there. It's there to be used, to be worked with. And that's what goes on here. To the extent that you don't do that, to that extent, it's crimped and doesn't happen. If we look at equality, what are the 7 stages of divestment? What are the 7 objects that Inanna puts on to enter the underworld, and those 7 objects that she takes off? They occur in the poem here in the Descent of Inanna on page 53. She places a crown on her head. She arranges the locks of her hair, ties the small lapis beads around her neck, and lets the double strand of the beads fall to her breast. She wraps the royal robe about her body. There's a Gnostic hymn to the royal robe and the losing of the royal robe, which is like a little insight kernel of this whole mythology that was preserved into Hellenistic times. Here it has the whole scale, that the robe was just the center of the 7. The royal robe of glory was just the center of 7, a whole pattern, a whole 7 levels give you the earthly handle onto the key to the octave. If you have 7 notes in an octave, you can intuit what the 8th note is and complete the octave. Because the 8th note is a repeating of the first note 1 level higher. So all you need is 7. And if you have the 7 together, in Greek, in esoteric words, it was called the Hymarmene. The 7 notes, the 7 planets. That once you have the 7 levels arranged in their alignment, you can intuit what the 8th is, just like intuiting what the 4th corner of the square is. So if you keep your wits about you, and don't let the ritual power carry you away and hypnotize you, which it tries to do because that's its nature. The very vehicle that would be a liberation for you is the very vehicle of your death. The very cobra that can kill you is also the kundalini that can free you. So you have to keep your wits about you and go through the alignment sequence, and when you complete it, transpose the beginning to the end. And when you're able to do that, when the alpha becomes the omega, then that form is complete in such a way that it resounds. And then one is able to make music. And if one understands that music and can hear that music, then you can dance. And when you can dance that dance before the Lord with all your might, that person is king. That person, like David. Why is David king? Because he knew how to dance before the Lord with all his might, holding nothing back. And who was able to see that that was true? Samuel. You are king. Well, I'm just a shepherd. I'm a little guy. David was only about 5'4". Yes, but you're the one dancing. You're the king. And so the Psalms of David are the musical songs that he sang because he could hear the music. It's actually very simple until you don't understand it, and then it's not visible at all. Then no one knows anything. Why are these traditions? Why is the declension of the Messiah from David? How does that work? That's how it is. So read page 53 in your text on Inanna to find out the 7 objects which Inanna puts on and the 7 objects she must divest, and try and intuit what is the 8th. What's the 8th quality that's there? And at the same time, take a look at the women's festivals. It's chapter 4 in Prolegomena by Jane Ellen Harrison. Prolegomena to the Study of Greek Religion. The women's festivals. And she has a series of festivals in here from ancient Greek mythology. The festivals are the rituals that must be held. And when those rituals are held in the aligned order that they are, and infused with a language that's fertile, then nature is evoked. Not out of some black magic way, not out of some stupid reductionistic theology, but out of the living words of the divine. And nature responds to man. And if he prays for rain, it'll rain. No hocus pocus. Just the parallel resonance of the real happening. More next week.